think a lot of people were taken by surprise at President Trump's assertion Wednesday that Ukraine started the war and that President Zelensky is a dictator. That's certainly not what many Americans feel about him, although I think it's safe to say there are people in the Trump political base who would just as soon like to see this war over and are not really concerned about how that happens. They're more concerned about the amount of money that the United States is spending to help Ukraine defend itself, and whether or not that money could be better spent on other things.
Now, the U.S. National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, recently urged Ukraine to tone it down and accept a critical mineral deal with the U.S. What does this demand tell us about the U.S. approach to this conflict?
Well, as I've said many times, Trump is a transactional leader. Everything is an exchange. And I believe that the Trump administration wants tangible rewards for America's economic and institutional support for Ukraine in its what I consider valiant struggle against the Russians. This includes access to rare earth metals that are present in Ukraine that America needs for its economic success and national security needs that are now found largely in China.
Now, on the other hand, the Kremlin has suggested that the rift between Trump and Zelensky could weaken Ukraine's position in the peace talks. What do you have on that? How do you think this growing tension between the US and Ukraine could influence the negotiations process with Russia?
I think the only person who may want this war in Ukraine over more than Donald Trump is Vladimir Putin. He knows it was a mistake. It's draining Russia's army. It's draining its economic resources. It is attacking its position on the global stage. It has not been good for him, even if the Russians have managed to secure some territory in Ukraine that they didn't previously hold. He needs this to be over. Russia there are many American security experts, serious people, who think of Russia as a gas station with an army. They have a big military, so you have to pay attention. And the only global commodity they have that anybody really wants are oil and natural gas. As long as this war continues, it inhibits Russia's ability to sell oil and natural gas freely and leaves them vulnerable to a sanctions regime. If Trump and the West could get its act together, they could start squeezing Putin economically in a way that he's going to feel in Moscow.
But here, in response to the US efforts to mediate this peace deal, Russian officials have already set strict red lines, particularly regarding the presence of NATO troops in Ukraine and Europe, definitely. Now, how do you think these red lines will shape the peace talks?
I think they provide a broad framework to bring everyone to the table, but I would not be surprised to see them dispensed with quickly. One of the things that I have learned watching Trump is that, very much like the American comedian Groucho Marx, he has his principles, and if you don't like those, he has others. He wants a successful conclusion to a negotiation where he gets more than he gave.
But we're speaking this time about the Russian strict.
No, I'm well aware. I'm well aware, and I am not sure that the Russians will be able to hold to their strict terms either. Trump could just as easily change positions from where he is now and show more sympathy for Ukraine. I think that of the two parties, it's tougher to convince President Zelensky to accept a deal that ends the war quickly, because I think that's an agreement that leaves the Russians with more formally Ukrainian territory, which was formerly Soviet territory, one ought to point out, than Zelensky may be comfortable with. At the end of the day, much as I hate that phrase, what Zelensky may get out of this is an end of the war and not much else. Now, I think that's a good outcome. You know, young Ukrainian men not having to die in war, young Ukrainian children not being slaughtered by Russian troops, young Ukrainian women not being raped by Russian mercenaries. That's a good thing. The war ending is a good thing for Ukraine. And no one ought to lose sight of that.
Now, the NATO chief, our NATO chief Mark Rutte, has emphasized Europe's vital role in securing peace in Ukraine. Now, how do you interpret Europe's responsibility, and what specifically security guarantees do you think should be prioritized in any potential agreement between Russia and Ukraine?
I'm more worried about the Western Europeans selling the Ukrainians down the river than I am the Americans or the Eastern Europeans. I think the Western Europeans have to some degree been dragged to this fight kicking and screaming. Once it became clear that it was not going to broaden, that it wasn't going to become a wider conflict, that it would remain confined to what we understand to be current or former Ukrainian territory. I don't know that the Europeans can be trusted to be honest brokers in this conversation. They want what's best for Europe. They don't want what's best for the world. They don't want what's best for Ukraine. They don't want what's best for the Poles or the Latvians or the Hungarians or the Czechs. They want what's best for the French and the German and the British.
Yeah. This is according to your point of view, right?
Yes.
But if I may ask you about a very important issue that should not go unnoticed. We've seen a press conference between the Ukrainian president, Zelensky, and the US envoy, Kellogg, that was abruptly cancelled. Now, how do you interpret that, or what does this mean?
It means they didn't have anything to say. And that I think the internal positions are still being worked out. They don't have an opportunity for a joint announcement because they haven't agreed on what the peace plan is going to look like. What is acceptable to Zelensky and to the Ukrainian people, and is also acceptable to the Americans.